Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nasser Musa, and I have the distinct honor of being your Master of Ceremony today. More traffic cop than Master of Ceremony, but nonetheless, it is my honor. I have, as I said, the honor of serving as the MC for this important event, the launch of Mary Harper's Getting Somalia Wrong. First, about the author, and then about the book. Mary Harper is the BBC World Service's Africa editor, a graduate of Cambridge University and SOAS. Mary has not just parachuted onto the continent and into Somalia today. She's been at this for 21 years. She's worked and reported from Sudan, Liberia, and the DRC. I'm told she's working her way into the Seychelles. And maybe with the sales of the book, she can afford to work in the Seychelles. Now, on her book, Getting Somalia Wrong. Excuse me. SRSG, but you get applauded first when I said that. Getting Somalia Wrong. Book reviewers in The Guardian, by distinguished academics, African experts, all say almost the same thing, that Mary's impressive achievement is one of the few coherent accounts of current Somali history. That the book should command the respect and interest of the world's academia, policy and development workers, and the general public, not least Somalis themselves. It is predicted that its impact will rank amongst and next to I.M. Lewis's 1965 published The Modern History of the Somali, which is now in its 5th edition. So I assume we'll be talking about your 5th edition fairly soon, Mary. As Adam Curtis, the documentary filmmaker said, Mary has done in her book what others rarely do. She outlined the hidden Somalia that has survived the decades of turmoil.
Karibu sana, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm just going to read you an extract from a time last year when in one day I visited 2 very, very different parts of the territory. So this is the extract. Visiting the two Somalis in a single day is quite an experience. The Somalia of Mogadishu is not a relaxing place to be. The city is heavily militarized and divided, its front lines constantly changing. Civilians are never safe, even from the African Union peacekeepers, who've been accused by human rights groups of firing heavy artillery into civilian areas. People's behavior is severely restricted. In areas controlled by Islamist insurgents, women have to cover themselves completely. The other Somalia is a world apart. I took the plane from Mogadishu to Somaliland's port town of Berbera, where I took a walk on the beach. I saw a group of young women frolicking in the sea, rolling about in the water, kicking their legs in the air, giggling, laughing and shrieking in delight. It was as if a lid had been taken off a pot of boiling water. People were allowed to breathe and express themselves freely. Unlike in the Somalia of Mogadishu, there were no African Union peacekeepers. There was just peace. It was on that day, as I was sitting in the lobby of a hotel in Somaliland, that I was told about Al-Shabaab's latest ruling, which banned men and women from shaking hands in public. It was early evening, and all around me in the hotel were Somali men and women gathering to drink tea, talk politics, and watch football on TV. Men dressed in colourful sarongs, flicking richly embroidered shawls over their shoulders, greeted the brightly dressed, bejewelled women by not only shaking their hands, but lightly kissing them, as is the traditional Somali way. The mood of the evening was light and romantic. Men graciously quoted Somali poems to their female companions. Earlier that day, in Mogadishu, the only women I saw were hidden away under thick, dark robes. So I hope that that passage shows what I wanted to do with my book, which was to try to take people beyond and behind the media stereotypes and myths that have been built up about Somalia. And I'm not saying that everything in Somalia is good. There is a lot that is bad and sad and tragic, and has been like that for well over 20 years. But there are also lots of positive and energetic and completely unique things going on there. And perhaps that is where the future lies. Maybe those things could be built on. And writing the book took me on this amazing journey, because I started to discover and to see for myself that under this label of Somalia being a failed state, and it has come top of the list of the world's most failed states for 4 years in a row, there are other things that are actually some aspects of life that are booming, especially in the economy. And one of these is that the centuries-old trade in livestock that has flourished in the past 20 years, maybe because there hasn't been a state, or at least partially because there hasn't been a state. And Somalia actually, a report by Chatham House, which is a very respected think tank, it found that Somalia exports more live animals than any other country in the world. And in the first 10 years following the fall of Siad Barre, the trade of livestock from Somalia to Garissa, here in Kenya, increased by 600%. So actually there are some incredibly positive developments, I suppose you could say. I also identified other models or inspirations, such as the example of the self-declared Republic of Somaliland, which in the past 20 years has built itself up from utter destruction to a functioning, it's not a recognized country, but it acts like one. It has a very, I think it's got the most democratic political system in the Horn of Africa. And I also think that the brief period that the Union of Islamic Courts was in power in south-central Somalia, again, that wasn't perfect, but things were more peaceful during that time. But unfortunately, the Americans and the Ethiopians thought it was some Al-Qaeda-linked movement, and they smashed it to pieces, and that gave rise to a far more radical group called Al-Shabaab, which has given people far more trouble than the Islamic courts ever did. My book tries to argue that building on those more successful stories, or at least getting ideas from them might be more productive than this endless cycle of military interventions and international conferences that there have been in the past 20 years. And I apologize to those of you here. I believe you're called the Nairobi bubble, whose very livelihood depends on the Somali problem continuing, at least until you retire. But I think, count myself amongst you, because I don't know whether I'd still have a job at the BBC if Somalia didn't keep me so busy in terms of reporting all the bad things that go on there. My book also describes how after the events of 9/11, the situation got much more complicated for Somalia and for Somalis. And as one Somali said to me, it changed everything. You know, every time a Somali tries to go through an airport or anything, they're subject to all sorts of sometimes humiliating questions. And I do think that viewing Somalia through the prism of Al-Qaeda is quite problematic. And I really was struck when I was in Kenya just a few days after the incursion last October, that, you know, the Kenyan media, which I normally have a lot of respect for, I was really shocked and disappointed by the way that it didn't seem to be able to describe what was happening. And I can understand if your country goes to war, you're sensitive, but the way it could only talk about Somalia through this war on terror angle, I found quite depressing, and I thought it might actually be counterproductive. I'm just going to read you now a short extract from my book, which talks about what can be quite a difficult relationship between the Somali and non-Somali communities here in Kenya. I spoke to a successful Somali businessman in his office in downtown Nairobi. He didn't want to give his name. "Do you know what the Kenyan police called Somalis?" he said. "They call us ATM machines. That's because the only way we can function is to bribe them at every turn." The businessman always uses the name of his non-Somali business partner in dealings with the authorities. A Somali identity, he says, is commercial suicide. Prejudice against Somalis permeates many levels of Kenyan society. On the one hand, they're feared and resented. On the other, they're admired for their business acumen. The opinions of this taxi driver who drove me to the Nairobi district of Eastleigh reflects those of many others in the country. "Somalis are very bad people," he said. "They sell everything in Eastleigh, even weapons. They're corrupt and they're always fighting each other because they are, by nature, a very violent people. Somali pirates come here to Nairobi and buy expensive houses in the best districts. We Kenyans hate Somalis, but they're very good at business." And these views were directly contradicted by a prominent businessman who owns shopping malls in Eastleigh. "I think that the Somalis are more of an asset than a burden to the Kenyan community because they create jobs. See how many people are working just here in this building. I'm providing hundreds of Kenyans with their daily bread. The government is collecting taxes from all the shops in Eastleigh. I believe the prejudice against Somalis is due to competition. Somalis have improved the lives of hundreds, if not millions, of Kenyans, giving them jobs as directors, accountants, maids, workmen, and so on. We have to look at both sides of the story." And I'm not arguing that Kenya should simply ignore what's known as the Somali problem, because absolutely elements of it exist here in Kenya. I mean, you've got, I don't know whether you could describe it as a city, but you've got 500,000 Somalis living in Dadaab. You've got radicalization not only of young Somalis but young Kenyans taking place here. Some of them go back to Somalia and fight for Al-Shabaab. But perhaps there's room for Kenya to be slightly more intelligent in its approach towards Somalia, not repeating the same old mistakes that have been done before. For example, the Kenyan troops, they might be tolerated now because they're making some progress against Al-Shabaab, it could be argued, with help from the Ethiopians and others. But they do, I believe, need an exit strategy, and one that would come quite quickly. Perhaps, like the Somalis themselves, the approach needs to be more creative and adventurous. The rest of the world also needs to recognize that Somalis can be very good at doing things for themselves. So that's how I conclude my book. And before I end, I'd just like to say that even though it was me that sat in the library and all the words in the book are mine or quotes from other people, there's no way I could have written this book. I think it really belongs to all the Somalis that I've spoken to who've helped me, my colleagues, my friends all over the world, who I've learned from. It's really their book, it's not really mine.